Tassie flung herself on Barter's body with a piercing scream that rang out over the whole valley. Scream after scream tore itself from that soft mass of clinging female loss, till her fair hair, was dabbled with Tom's blood, and actually entangled with broken bits of hair-covered bone that had been Tom's hard skull. Some said they heard her screams as far down the valley as Tith Barn. Lily Rogers maintained she heard them as she picked parsley from Miss Drew's dinner in the Abbey House garden. For Miss Drew's dinner, not from. John made an instinctive movement to pursue the murderer, but the tramp, hearing wild cries from the slope of the hill, and seeing Mr. Evans and Cordelia rushing up the ascent towards him, dashed back into the tower and clambered, swift as a monkey, up the tall ladders inside. For quite the space of a couple of minutes, after his first motion of pursuit, John stood stock still, his face so contorted with horror that it assumed the appearance of a wooden puppet, listening in spellbound, frozen apathy to the girl's heart-rending screams. A semicirque of flying rooks, just 7 in number, flapped with creaking wings across the top of the tower, making their way northwest towards Markmoor. Little did they reckon the cracking of the skull of a man upon a patch of grass. As for a tiny earth beetle that was foraging for its insect prey just there, it scurried away from Tom's blood as if it had been a lake of brimstone. In addition to this, a panic-stricken hare, fleeing in wild terror from the man and a woman who was rushing up the hill, came from its long, desperate leaps almost up to John's feet, and then, remaining motionless there for a second, rushed past the tower and away down the slope towards Havyot Gap. The appearance of this hare roused John from his paralysis. He ran to the door of the tower and pulled it wide open. The couple of minutes' delay, however, had enabled Fintaler to ascend, for he climbed like an animal rather than a man, to the top of the last ladder. But here he was met with Mad Bet and a cold paroxysm of frenzied remorse. Without giving her unfortunate devotee time to reach the stone platform where she knelt to receive him, the woman seized the thin bare wrist that Codfin extended towards her and flung him off the ladder. Fintaler fell backwards, head downwards, and John, stepping hurriedly from the door to the top man's death cry, saw his body crash to the ground in a cloud of dust, and heard the ghastly thud upon the ground with which his neck was broken. A moment of silence for Codfin here. Like a great bald-headed vulture that had been shot through the wing, Mad Bet on the stone summit of the tower crouched with convulsive shudderings against the parapet. Here she lay, without thought or purpose, moaning in a low voice to herself, and covering the cold slab against which she pressed her face with piteous tears and murmurous endearments, as though it were the mangled body of the man who had roused that terrible nerve worm that devours hearts. Mad Bet had not seen what had really occurred down there. To her, disturbed in tragic consciousness, it was John who lay dead at the foot of the tower with his skull smashed in. There is that about an uttermost sorrow which levels all distinctions, and not Deianira for Heracles, nor Isua for Tristram, moaning and murmured in her lost love with more absoluteness of pitiful grief than this bald-headed creature on the top of the tower to her supposedly dead idol. Round about her, crouching from a couple of great swifts, these pointed winged demons of the high air flew in narrowing circles, uttering their short, shrill cries, and their sharp sounds were answered by the melancholy and more familiar wailings of the peewits in the lower levels of Torfield, disturbed by Tossie's screams and callings out, warning to one another. Broken under that bar, Mad Dad envisaged the sweet head of her dear love. While the wild screams of Tossie over Tom's body joined the age-old chorus, Quis desidero sit pudor aut modus tam capi capitis. Can't translate that for you, sorry, my line is not that good. Something about, let's see, quis, what is desired, maybe? Desidero? Sit. What does sit mean? I should know that one. Pudor. Could be. From the earth. Tam carry capitis. I don't know. Body. I can't help you there. The green twilight was being sucked down now by undulations of the green earth. The invisible dews were falling. A dusty night wind was rising up from beyond Queen Sedgemoor. The first cold stars were coming out over the three horizons. Where the sun had gone down in the west, there lingered only a faint dying trace of the livid before-night whiteness. This actual moment of the Earth's revolution, although under very different atmospheric conditions in China, in India, on the banks of the Danube, by the Black Sea and in the tents of the Sahara, in battle, murder, pestilence, and shipwreck, in bolted doom, sudden death was rushing on the hairy scalps of men. That's a nice phrase there. Did Tossie feel her grief worse than any of those who mourned? Or were the moans of some old Chinese wife on the banks of the Yellow River yet more heartbroken? The terrible silence of some despairing Malay in the Singapore hovel yet more crushing? As for John, the worst moment of the whole unspeakable nightmare was when he lifted that plump bundle of wild hysteria from off the body of his friend, and laying her on the grass, dabbed with his handkerchief at her brow and cheeks, and actually removed from his fingers and thumb a fragment of Tom's smashed skull from her sticky hair. She rolled over, and he was glad she did, for her face was shocking to him, and began smothering her convulsions in the green grass, her fingers plucking and clutching at its cold, earthy roots. It was then, just before Evans and Cordelia reached them, that he snatched off his overcoat and covered Tom's head and shoulders with it. "Oh, what has happened? What has happened?" panted Cordelia. "Has that man gone? Has he hurt you? Who is hurt? Is Mr. Barter hurt? Has he killed Mr. Barter? Where is he? Have you let him go?" Mr. Evans spoke, not a single word. He did two things. And these he did with a punctual, mechanical precision of a consummate actor performing a long-ago perfectly rehearsed part. He stared round him till he caught sight of the iron bar lying on the ground. And stooping down, he lifted up the bloodied end from the earth and deliberately wiped it off with a handful of grass. Then he went over to where the body was lying. Hesitating for the flicker of a second, he fell on his knees and, removing John's coat from Barter's crushed head, gazed at what was revealed. The sight had an immediate physical effect upon him. He replaced the coat calmly enough, but rising to his feet and turning his back to the corpse, he began vomiting with cataclysmic heavings of his tall frame. Was the sexual nerve in Mr. Evans, that sadism-drunk worm of the pit, stirred to indomitable excitement as he went through these motions? Mercy of Jesus forbid. That nerve-worn worm lay, stretched out in the man's vitals as he vomited there, cold and constricted, limp as the sloughed-off skin of a summer snake. I think that guy needed Faces of Death tapes or something. Cordelia, who had showed signs of being more concerned over Mr. Evans as he swayed and retched and swayed than over the murder itself, now sat down on the grass by Tossie's side and took her head in her lap. The first time she did this, the distracted girl beat her off with her hands and tried to get up and rush over to Barter's body. But the sight of that coat hiding the crushed head brought so sickening a sense of her loss that she hid her face between Cordelia's knees and broke into piteous wailings. These wailings carry no longer, however, than terrifying note in them that her first shrill screams had had, and by degrees they sank down from sheer exhaustion into low moans, till at last the unhappy girl lay quite silent and still. Mr. Evans, whose paroxysm of vomiting had ceased now, obeyed John with a humble docility, as the latter demanded his help in dragging forth the body of the murderer from the tower. This quiet but by no means stupid docility became a fixed habit with Mr. Evans from now on. It was not that the man's sanity was affected by the accumulating shocks of this day. What it was affected by, what it seemed to be, was a substitution of a definite sense of guilt over Barter's death for the less tangible but far more deadly remorse over the sadistic dreams and fantasies. This new guilt of his, the man took calmly, and in a certain sense samely. But it had a much more disastrous effect upon him from an external and practical point of view than the other. When the 26th of February dawned, poor Cordy was startled to discover that her Owen's hair had turned white. He had indeed become visibly and palpably, and in every physical respect, if not an old man, certainly an elderly man. It was lucky for Cordelia that the tiny annuity, so carefully purchased for her by Mr. Gurd, was enough for their bare needs in the little house over Bovetown, on the hill leading up to St. Edmund's brickyard. For after this crisis in his days, Mr. Evans found himself quite incapable of going on with his work in number 2's shop. That really elderly and indeed extremely aged gentleman did not feel incumbent upon him to regard his now sleeping partner as in any way entitled to share the ensuing increment from their more than ever lucrative business. Nor, in spite of Cordelia's indignation, could she induce Mr. Evans to make any claims. Slowly and laboriously, sometimes writing no more than a few pages a day, did Mr. Evans continue working at his life's task, the monumental Vitus Merlini Ambrosiani. But luckily for him, Cordelia did not extend to the intellectual interests of her husband that impatient contempt which she always felt for her father's religious doctrines. That culminating scene when she had exercised by her heroic gesture behind the brown blinds the nerve devil in Mr. Evans had endeared the man to her in the way mothers are endeared to a deformed or an idiot child. And when her real child perished later after a premature birth, she lavished upon its helpless parent all the savage maternal protectiveness that the infant would have claimed if it had lived. Well, I'll keep on reading. Visitors to Glastonbury can still see, when a little weary, perhaps, of romantic antiquities, they wander up Wells Old Road towards Edmund Hill Lane, with a view of inspecting those famous tile works that have given the town its mellow roofs, a slow-moving, absent-minded, white-haired gentleman, reading a blue-covered book as he walks along or as he leans upon the fence that leads into those suburban fields between Wells Old Road and Maidencroft Lane. This book, if any passer-by were bold enough to pursue its title, would turn out to be Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, but such a stranger would not be able to guess that what Mr. Evans is searching for there is something not to be found in Mallory or at all, nor indeed in any Grail book, since the time of the great Welshman Bleseries, namely, the real meaning of the mystical word Expulsamore. Well, it's getting kind of depressing now, isn't it? Anyway, till next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Cheers.